Welcome, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to BJ. I'm Rabbi Shuli Passo. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at B'nai Jeshurun. We're so delighted that you're here for this very important and timely program. I just want to remind people, please, to turn off your cell phones, and also there are some folks walking around with note cards and pencils. We'll be doing Q&A by note card, so if you'd like to have a note card to be able to jot down a question, just raise your hand and someone from the staff will come around. Also a reminder that we're filming both the live stream and also for a documentary film that's being made about the case that you're going to hear about tonight. So if you don't want to be filmed, just make sure you're not right over there, basically. So that's, most of you are not right over there. About a year and a half ago, a week or so after the rallies and the violence in the city of Charlottesville, Rabbi Lauren Grabel Herman of the Society for Advancement of Judaism on West 86th Street put out a call to a number of clergy in the neighborhood, asking us what we wanted to do as a faith community on the Upper West Side in response to what had happened in Charlottesville. And very quickly, a planning committee was formed, and over 70 organizations signed on as co-sponsors of an event that was held at the Fourth Universalist Church, which had had a swastika carved into its front door not too long before that event. And over 600 people got together, and that night in late August, we used the tools in our toolkit as religious leaders to bring together our communities to say, we will not tolerate white nationalism, bigotry, hate, violence. We used our tools as religious leaders to bring people together to respond with love and with comfort and with support and with community. And tonight, we are very, very fortunate to hear from some amazing, amazing people who are using the tools in their toolkit as litigators in their legal toolkit to fight against white nationalism and bigotry and hatred and violence that we've been seeing in Charlottesville and elsewhere in this country. It is quite a lineup. I can't even read everyone's full bio because it's so long and amazing, but I do want to share just a little bit of back information about who you're going to hear from tonight and who we're so blessed to hear from this evening. Karen Dunn is one of America's top trial lawyers, the only woman to be named Litigator of the Year by the American Lawyer, which noted, if the case is high stakes, high profile, and hard fought, don't be surprised to find Karen Dunn there. Before she went into litigation, corporate litigation, she worked in all three branches of government as an associate White House counsel to President Obama, an assistant United States attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia, as communications director to then Senator Hillary Clinton, and as a law clerk to Chief Judge Merrick Garland of the Supreme Court of Appeals of the D.C. Circuit and Justice Stephen Breyer of the United States Supreme Court. Roberta Bobby Kaplan is the co-founding partner of Kaplan, Hecker, and Fink, one of a handful of women-led elite litigation boutiques in the country. Many of you may know Robbie from her work representing Edith Windsor in the landmark case of United States v. Windsor, in which the Supreme Court held that a key provision of the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional, leading to marriage equality nationwide. And BJ was very involved in that campaign in New York State. Robbie helped launch the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund to provide legal representation to women who have experienced sexual harassment. And our conversation tonight is going to be moderated by Amy Spitalnik, who is the Executive Director of Integrity First for America, the organization that is supporting the Charlottesville litigation. Amy joins IFA with over a decade of experience in government politics and advocacy. She most recently served as the communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General. Previously, Amy served as the communications advisor and spokesperson for the New York City mayor. So it's a wonderful conversation that we're going to open up to tonight. Co-sponsoring the event are three other organizations, faith-based organizations that were involved in planning that post-Charlottesville rally a year and a half ago, the Church of St. Paul and St. Andrew, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, and Fourth Universalist Church. And it's our pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight, especially a special thanks as well to the people who are watching online. So we're going to leave time at the end to take questions submitted via note cards, which I think are being passed out. And as the Rabbi said, we're here tonight to talk about the violence that took place in Charlottesville in 2017 and the lawsuit that was filed in response to it against the 24 defendants who were responsible for conspiring to orchestrate that violence. I'm the executive director of Integrity First for America, which is the organization supporting the case. We're a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization dedicated to holding those accountable who violate longstanding principles of our democracy, like civil rights and equal justice. Unite the Right, as the Charlottesville rally was known, was a flashpoint, but it was by no means an isolated incident. We only need to look to Pittsburgh, or to the supermarket shootings in Kentucky, or to even last week's attack on Jussie Smollett to see the extent of the crisis we're now facing. The ADL just released a disturbing new study that found right-wing extremists killed more people last year than any year since 1995, which was the year of the Oklahoma City bombing. Right-wing extremism is linked to every 2018 extremist murder in the United States. The ADL also reports that in 2017, anti-Semitic incidents surged nearly 60% nationwide. In fact, Identity Europa, which is one of the defendants in our suit, was responsible for half of the incidents of white supremacist propaganda on college campuses in 2016. Many of you have seen footage of what happened in Charlottesville. We're going to show a short clip just to give you a sense of what we're talking about tonight. I want to warn you that it is a little bit disturbing and upsetting. It's going to be a relatively short clip, which we'll roll now.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Blood and soil! 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 Whose streets? Our streets! 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 Whose streets? Our streets!
I think we can, yep. Thank you. I think everyone saw what they needed to see. Like many of you, when I had learned of what happened, I had a very hard time squaring that with the country that I knew and loved. And I was frustrated. I felt like there was nothing I could do. I was angry, I was sad. And then a few months later, I was reading the newspaper and I learned about a lawsuit that was being filed on behalf of a coalition of Charlottesville community members. The lawsuit, which is the one we're here to talk about tonight, is being litigated by an incredible team of lawyers led by Robbie Kaplan and Karen Dunn. And we're officially going to trial this year, which Robbie and Karen will tell us about. So to start, Robbie, if you can maybe start by sharing a little bit about your background and how it informs your work, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how this case came about.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think like everyone here, kind of everything about my background always informs my work. And with respect to this case, I think there are two things that kind of crucially kind of gave me the idea, which we can talk about, of how to do this and when to do it. One, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. It was kind of like growing up on the Upper West Side, the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, in probably the most Jewish concentrated area at that time in the United States of America. And I remembered thinking as a kid a lot. I went to Hebrew school and Jewish school in the 70s and 80s, and there was a lot of Holocaust curriculum, perhaps too much Holocaust curriculum, in my when I was a kid. And so I remember thinking a lot as a kid, something ironically my 12-and-a-half-year-old son is now thinking. Never thought he would have to think that, but I remember thinking as a kid, what would I have done if, God forbid, I had been alive in Europe during those years? What would I have done? And I'd only thought, of course, it was a theoretical question, but it was something I remember like going to bed night after night after night as a kid thinking about. So that's point one. Point two, I kind of grew up as a very young kid. I liked to talk a lot, and so at some point I realized that if you could get paid to talk if you were a lawyer. And I wanted to be a lawyer from as a very young child, and I wanted to both be a great lawyer for private clients, commercial clients, and I wanted to be a great civil rights lawyer. So I had the great privilege of representing a woman who you all know by the name of Edie Windsor in what became a landmark case that established equal dignity for all Americans, straight and gay. And that case taught me about dignity and about how the fact of the matter is it doesn't matter, and this is very much a theme in our case now, whether it's homophobia or anti-Semitism or racism or sexism, people who share those beliefs tend to share all of them. And what's very important about our Constitution and about our system of laws is that we believe that all human beings were created equal and that we all have a right to be respected with equal dignity. So I think it was kind of those two strands. I mean, I think the Windsor case gave me the idea that you could really make change in a very fundamental way. And I was kind of driven by my Jewish roots to want to fight back about what happened and what you guys just saw on that screen.
Karen, can you share a little bit about your background?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having us here. I want to mention that B'nai Jeshurun was my grandmother's shul in her later years, and it's really nice to be here. I'll not get too upset, but I wish she could be here to see this. And you know, one reason I mention her is, like Robbie, I grew up really being educated about how important it is that we never forget the past and the real, truly terrible things that can happen if we don't focus on incremental change, such as what you just saw behind you. And I think the fact is that it's not really a hard decision to decide to do what Robbie and I are doing. It really isn't. I think when the opportunity presents itself and you are asked, will you do this? Will you stand up against things that are so morally reprehensible and against the law? That's not really a hard question. Earlier in my career, as was discussed before, I came to private practice and became a trial lawyer, mostly for very large technology companies. I worked in the government. I worked in the government for a long time, and part of that time was as a prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia. Our case, as you'll hear, is in the Western District of Virginia. And when I was there, I prosecuted a variety of cases, including national security cases. And this is the case in private practice, including anything I've done on the pro bono side, that is the most like a criminal prosecution that I could imagine. So in actuality, my prosecutor skills are coming in quite handy in this civil case. But the reason that I do this now and the reason that I did it before is that I believe that we all have a responsibility to contribute to the fabric of our society and in the way that we can. And as Robbie said, we get paid to talk. So what we need to do is we need to talk to a jury, and we need to persuade them that laws were broken and people were injured. And that's what we plan to do at trial later this year.
So you sprang into action very quickly after the rally happened. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how the case initially came about?
Yeah, so I started my own law firm, Kaplan Hecker, now called Kaplan Hecker and Fink, on July 1, 2017. And we had just moved into, we are officer in the Empire State Building, and we had just moved into our offices at the beginning of August when Charlottesville happened. And one of the goals of my new firm was to really a deep commitment to doing public service work and public interest work. And so as Charlottesville was happening, I made a decision, perhaps in retrospect a bad decision, that we should all, there were only about 6 of us then, that we should all, as a firm, watch the news coverage. And I remember we watched the press conference that the president gave over lunch. It's not exactly a light lunch topic, but that was my decision. And what I say in retrospect, it might have been a mistake, is a couple of the people who were working for me got so upset, I remember, that they kind of had to leave. And as I was watching...
Leave the lunch, not the firm.
Leave the lunch. They're still at the firm, so far. And as I was watching it, I immediately remembered, before I had started my firm, I had spent 25 years at the law firm of Paul Weiss. And I remembered a case that my mentor, a guy by the name of Marty London, one of the great trial lawyers of his time, had done about a website years ago called the Nuremberg Files, where they would put up the photos of doctors who performed abortions in the West with their home addresses and their other identifying information. And then when violence happened, and it did, one of the doctors was killed, they would put a red X over the doctor's face. And the argument in that case was that it was an unlawful incitement to violence and it violated a federal statute that protected the safety of abortion and providers. And I thought to myself, God, there's got to be a way to do something like that. It turns out that we're not pursuing the precise theory here, but there's got to be a way to do something like that here. And I called up, I can say in this audience because everyone will know who she is, I called a very good friend, a very dear friend of mine, Dahlia Lithwick, who writes for Slate, who I knew lived in Charlottesville. And I said, Dahlia, I have this idea. What do you think? Here's my legal idea. What do you think? And she said, I think it's a great idea. I'm actually moving to Brooklyn right now because I've decided, my husband and I have decided that we can't continue to live here. It's too just disturbing and upsetting. They have 2 sons, so we're actually moving to New York. But I will hook you up with some folks in Charlottesville, and I think it's a great idea. Within 48 hours, we were on a plane to Charlottesville. We met that week with people. This is really still incredibly fresh. It was a very difficult meetings. Some of the people we met with then are clients and the plaintiffs in this case. I remember, and again, I'm probably not proud of this, but I'll say it anyway. We were driving, after meeting with all these folks, we were driving back to the airport to come to New York, and a couple of my colleagues, they're still with me too, shockingly, started to cry in the car. And I said, you gotta buck it up, guys. We gotta fight this. This is about fighting back. And we gotta hold our tears till after we've won the case. Again, probably not the most sensitive thing to say. I confess to that. And then we got back to New York, we started to work on the legal theory, which we can talk about. And the minute I realized we had a really viable, strong legal theory, I realized that I couldn't do this alone. And I wouldn't say that Karen and I knew each other. We weren't close. I had kind of been a fangirl of Karen's from afar, but I didn't know her. But I had the chutzpah to pick up the phone and call her and say, hey, I've got this case about Charlottesville. We're going to sue some Nazis. Will you join me? And Karen, being Karen, said, absolutely. And so that was really the beginning of the case.
Karen, can you speak about the case itself, where it currently stands, and the basis of the lawsuit?
Sure, let the record reflect what I actually said was, let me check with my husband. And we collectively said absolutely. So where does the case stand? Right now, well, first of all, we're set for trial in July of 2019. And that gives us just a few, is this important here? Okay. And that gives us just a few months to complete all of discovery and get this case ready to be tried. We actually had a very large strategy meeting today where we sketched out how we're going to get done everything we need to get done. We have a lot of depositions to take. We have a lot of documents to review that we've collected, a lot of electronic evidence that we need to sort through. And so we'll be doing all of that, the very sort of granular, detailed, and difficult work of litigation between now and July. Thus far in the case, we have had some very nice successes. We got what we view to be a great opinion from the judge on our motion to dismiss opposition. There is basically two components that are worth mentioning. The claims that we bring are essentially conspiracy claims. So we have alleged a very large conspiracy to do violence among the leaders of the groups that effectuated what you saw behind you, or behind me. And the defense to this from the other side is really two-pronged. One part is they say, well, we were acting in self-defense, and we'll get to that. And the second is what we were doing is protected by the First Amendment. And so our motion to dismiss arguments really centered on the conspiracy claims and the First Amendment defense. And the judge allowed the case to go forward against the vast majority of the defendants on the conspiracy claims, and also included some very helpful language for us about the First Amendment defense. And in case it was not clear, he reiterated something that the law has long recognized, which is that the First Amendment does not protect violence or conspiracies to do violence, which is what happened here. So we believe we have it's a pretty ambitious case, to be honest. There's no case like this has ever been brought on this magnitude under the legal theories that we are applying. But we feel like it's a strong case, and we feel like we have a very fair and reasonable judge. And ultimately, of course, this case will be tried to a jury of people from the Western District of Virginia.
Can you discuss a bit about why you chose the 25 defendants that you did and their roles in planning and executing the violence?
Yeah, so what made Charlottesville so unprecedented and resulted in the unprecedented size of the case that Karen just described is really technology, frankly. Technology in this respect is both a blessing and a curse, to quote the Torah. It allowed wonderful things to happen, but it also allowed all these disparate groups who had kind of been existing, kind of isolated from each other for many, many years. A lot of these guys are guys who kind of played computer games in their parents' basement. Through this series of chat rooms called Discord, to decide to communicate with each other and then to organize this conspiracy. So the planning went on for weeks. It started in the spring. It went on for weeks. After Charlottesville happened, an organization, and I don't know much about it other than I think they're computer hackers, but an organization called Unicorn Riot went in and hacked into Discord and published these Discord chats that these guys had, all of them were men pretty much, to plan what happened in Charlottesville. And the planning was intricate. They would talk about, there was a leadership channel, there was a transportation channel, there were channels about what weapons to bring, there was discussion about how to make it look like it was self-defense when it really wasn't. And then, frankly, extraordinarily, there was just, you think about the banality of evil. There's some banality of evil here. They have discussions about not putting mayonnaise on the sandwiches because it might get bad during the day on Saturday, or what kind of non-sprouted bread they prefer for lunch, or what's the best way to sew a swastika onto your shirt. I mean, I kid you not. But from those chats, we were able to figure out who the leaders were, and that's really what we based our complaint on. It wasn't a guessing game. We had these chats that had been kind of leaked. Now we have a lot more of them. And we used that to figure out who the leadership was, and those are the people we targeted in the case.
Yeah, and you know, it led to the strength of this case that the people who are the defendants in our case are really people who occupy leadership positions. So this is not a case about people who showed up to see what happened that day, or happen to be on the same street, or even happen to join in some chanting. This is a case against people who led the effort, who planned the effort, who plotted the effort, who organized the other people, and who fully knew what they were doing. And there's not going to be a question about that.
They even talked about driving cars into protesters, right?
Yeah, so the thing as people probably remember from the news, the pictures you saw were from a torchlight rally and march that happened on Friday night, August 11th. This was an event where the defendants are going to claim that this was a spontaneous happening, where it just so happened that tons of people marched in unison with lit torches and threw unidentified fluid on other people. And just so happened that way. Then the next day was the very tragic event where James Fields, who was recently prosecuted in the Commonwealth, drove his car into a crowd of protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring a number of our plaintiffs. And what's really very striking is that when you look at what is said in these chats and you see the pictures that they posted about driving vehicles into crowds of people and how much damage that can do, there is nobody who is going to believe that somehow that was an accident that happened. And there is nobody that is going to believe that the people doing those postings and encouraging that violence were somehow surprised that it wasn't foreseeable to them when this actually happened. And so that is part of what we're going to show. We're going to be able to piece together from idea to planning to execution all of the events that happened that caused so much violence and so much injury.
I think as we saw in the video before, while these guys clearly hate everyone who's different than them or who has a belief that's different than them, they also seem to be very motivated by anti-Semitism at the root of this hate. Could you talk a little bit about that, they were chanting blood and soil, they were chanting Jews will not replace us. Clearly this is a big factor in motivating the Charlottesville rally and in their general beliefs.
So I don't get surprised by much, unfortunately or fortunately, in my practice. I've done a lot of cases in my life, but there's one thing about this case I really shocked me as we really got into the evidence, and that is that there's just no question, zero question, that while, as I said before, they hated black people, they hated women, they hate gay people, there's one group of people who they hate more than any other group, and that is Jews. And the degree to which anti-Semitism, overt appeals to the language of Hitler, and to saying things like Jews will not replace us, and talking about Jews in these, these ways and in these caricatures that literally look like Nazi cartoons from the 1930s and 1940s, seems to be the animating motivation behind what they did. I know Lenore Weitzman is here, and she knows probably a lot more than I do about the history of this and why that may be so. I can't explain that. But I have to say I've been absolutely shocked in this case by the strength and the kind of the animating animus of anti-Semitism. And it really affected what happened that day. So the temple if people don't know this, the temple, there's only one real kind of building temple in Charlottesville, and it's a block and a half from the park on Saturday where the Robert E. Lee statue is, which kind of where a lot of the violence was. And so when the Nazis and white supremacists and others kind of congregated and kind of descended on that park, they all had to go in the same area, and many of them walked past the synagogue deliberately. The synagogue, of course, knew about this in advance, given in particular what had happened Friday night. They removed all the working Torahs, other than to leave one there for Saturday morning services, which they did very early. They had to leave temple after that Saturday morning service kind of through the back door in a side street, and I've been there to see it. They had, like many synagogues, a display in a glass case, a Holocaust Torah that had been recovered after the Holocaust. And more than one member of the synagogue said to me how ironic it was that this Torah that had survived the Holocaust was now being surrounded once again by Nazis. And it was petrified. They were very worried. They had a security guard there. At a certain point, they told him to go home because there were threats on Discord and other chat rooms about torching the synagogue. And since then, I'm sure everyone's aware of this, it's been still very difficult. There's a nursery school at the synagogue. The kids used to play in that park. And the security level and kind of the level of day-to-day fear is still incredibly high.
Can you walk us through the plaintiffs in the case? These are all Charlottesville community members that were impacted in very similar ways, whether it be on Friday night or Saturday by the violence. Can you walk us through who the plaintiffs are?
So all of the plaintiffs were people who were there, as Amy said, one of the 2 days. They kind of fall into two groups. We have a number of plaintiffs, 4, if I'm counting correctly, who were there on Saturday when James Fields drove his car into the crowd. One of them is, if you've probably all seen that, it won the Pulitzer Prize, the photo of the very large African-American guy kind of being hurled in the air with his fiancée who was there kind of nearby. So both his fiancée and they're now married, are plaintiffs. There were 2 other students nearby who were also struck by the car. One of them had her leg shattered, who are plaintiffs. If you've seen pictures, I'm sure everyone has seen these pictures of the ministers and actually the rabbi standing on Saturday arm to arm. There's kind of a very tall minister with a beard. His name is Seth Willesboe. He was very involved in kind of standing up to this hate. He's one of our plaintiffs. And then we have a couple kids, my wife always yells at me when I say that, a couple of undergraduate students at UVA who were there on Friday night, you saw in the video, who were standing around. That's a Thomas Jefferson statue. It's right at the end of the rotunda at UVA. They walked across the yard at UVA, up the stairs, down the stairs, descended where the statue is, and these incredibly brave kids were standing there guarding the statue, and they had tiki torch fuel and lit matches and lit tiki torches thrown at them, and were injured as a result of that. So that's basically the group.
And this seems like a good moment. Integrity First for America is launching a new campaign tomorrow, but you all get a sneak peek. It's called 10,000 Voices for Charlottesville, and it's meant to show these very courageous, brave plaintiffs that we have their back, that they are taking on this terrifying task of challenging these Nazis and white supremacists in court, and we want to show them that people around the country believe in them and appreciate what they're doing. So if you go to integrityfirstforamerica.org, you'll be prompted to sign up and show these plaintiffs that you have their back. It's called our 10,000 Voices campaign. So related to that, one of the things that I know the 2 of you have experienced, that Integrity First has experienced, and certainly the plaintiffs have experienced, are some of these threats since the lawsuit has been filed. Can you talk a little bit about that and what it means?
Yeah, so the defendants in this case, who include Cantwell, who you saw in the video, who include people like Richard Spencer, who I'm sure people have heard of, Kessler, the guy who's the head of Identity Europa and Identity Europa, and all assorted other groups, obviously are not very happy about the fact that we've sued them in this case. We don't have the ability, I wish we did, but we don't have the ability in this case to put them in jail. But we do have the ability to not only get injunctive relief, but to get very large money judgments against them. And they're doing all kinds of things to avoid that. One of them filed for bankruptcy. It's not going to work. We're going to be able to make a motion in the bankruptcy court that still makes him liable. Others are doing other things, and threatening us and threatening the plaintiffs is one of their chief tactics, and having their supporters threaten us. We have been subjected to a fair amount of threats. My office and my law firm is in the Empire State Building, not just because the views are great, but because it's got the best security of any building in the city, and it's very safe for us to be there. But, without going into detail, my mother was not exactly happy, and I haven't shared many details with her, to even know that these things exist. And as bad as it is for us or for integrity, that's nothing compared to the threats our clients have received and still receive. Seth in particular has been the subject of a lot of them. One of the young students, 3 weeks after Charlottesville, a guy called, her mother picked up the phone, and we have this recording, which I think will be in evidence at trial, started screaming just truly horrific threats at her. These people mean business, unfortunately. Pittsburgh was not a coincidence. They truly intend to kill Jewish people. That is what they want to do, and we have to live our lives accordingly. Again, we're doing everything we can to make sure we and our clients and everyone on our team stay safe.
Yeah. So the only thing I would add to this is one thing that is so telling to me about the way that our defendants and others approach this is that these events were called Charlottesville 2.0. And so if you think about that, what that means is that there actually was a Charlottesville 1.0, and it was in practice and preparation for Charlottesville 2.0. And also, by the way, that means that they intend for there to be a Charlottesville 3.0. This is, when Robbie says they mean business, that's true, but this is also not a one-time occurrence for them. They want this to be ongoing. They want to be, at Charlottesville 9.0. And so part of what we are trying to do is stand in the way of that. But the intent is written all over everything that they did, including the way that they talk about it, including how they marketed it, including how they labeled it. And one reason our case ended up being so big is because this was the largest, most well-attended gathering of the alt-right that has ever happened. So if you go big, you gotta kind of go big in the lawsuit too.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and I believe note cards have gone around, and the rabbi's collecting them, so get your questions in now. But one more before we go to the audience. So we're headed to trial. What does it mean to win? What does success look like here?
Yeah. I think primarily success is a jury verdict that says very clearly that under the facts and the law in America, in our system of justice, that this is not permitted and will be a community rejection of this conduct as violent and unlawful. And I think it is our hope that we will win that jury verdict, and that when and if we do, that will echo throughout the country at least, and will be a clear communication that this cannot continue. And I am somebody, I love jury trials. I think there is something extremely powerful in having a group of people, regular people, cast judgment and hold people accountable for their actions under the law. So I think that is definition of success one. As Robbie said, we also are pursuing a request for money damages. And as much as these guys want to say, well, we have no money, it's not free to organize a mass rally of tons of people and everyone dresses the same and carries their own tiki torch. I mean, this stuff, the travel, it all costs money. And our group of defendants is not just individuals, it's groups. Is the groups that are the leaders of these conspiracies to cause violence. And so we also would view it as a great success if we could deprive these groups and these individuals of the funds that they are using every day to cause violence in our communities. And I think if those two things happen, we'd be extremely pleased.
Yeah, as always, I agree with Karen. I think in our country's history, every several years, that we have a big trial that's kind of means more than just the trial itself. It kind of educates the public. You can go back to the Scopes Monkey trial, the companion case to the Windsor case. There was a trial in the Prop 8 case that I think certainly had that function. And I think this trial will have that function, hopefully, will have that function for making it very clear in this country that we do not tolerate this in the United States of America. Amy talked about 10,000 voices. We're going to have the voices of 12 jurors, which are really going to matter, and I think are going to speak for the rest of this country that this is not what we stand for here.
And there have also been incremental wins, right? So for instance, what the defendants saying that they don't want to be sued again in perhaps planning another similar rally?
Yeah, Charlottesville 3.0 was a total bust that they planned for last summer, and the reason it was is because and we track them because they all kind of
Well,
talk.
they track us, so we track
Yeah,
them.
we track them back. And they all talk on the internet now still, and there was a huge amount of discussion about if we go do Charlottesville 3.0, we're going to get sued, so we can't do it, and there was kind of debates amongst them about what to do, and both Charlottesville 3.0 and then the thing that Kessler planned in DC, which was similar, turned out to be big bustos, I think in large part because of our lawsuit.
Great. I think we are about to get our questions from the audience. I want to make sure we have enough time.
Great. So, hi, everybody. I'm Larissa Wall. I'm the Social Justice Program Manager here at the Synagogue. I'm very excited that you're all here, and thank you so much for being here as well. So the first question we have is, are there historical precedents for this case, and what are they?
Well, so that's a great question. One thing that we usually talk about whenever we talk about this case, but for some reason neglected to mention, is that one of the statutes that we are suing under is the Ku Klux Klan Act, which is a Reconstruction-era statute that somehow has become very relevant in the year 2019. That alone, I think, is really astonishing. And as you would imagine, the precedents here are not an exact fit to our case, in part because most of the cases where the Ku Klux Klan Act was relevant really didn't have to do with events on this scale, although there are a couple where it would be, more than one person victimized. But that we are relying on that statute as well as a number of state law statutes, which is very clear in our view that this is not permissible. But that's sort of the main thing. The other thing that I would say is we are in the Fourth Circuit, where the law about the First Amendment and what the Fourth Circuit calls true threats is very strong and will be very helpful to us. So in part, we've already relied on these legal precedents and the case law that we have available to us to get this case past the motion to dismiss stage. And then at some point between now and trial, we'll also have a summary judgment argument where those arguments will make a return.
Yeah. Lots of times plaintiffs bring up KKK Act of 1871 cases and don't succeed, and that's kind of commonplace. I think the most successful recent cases, and I argued this at the motion, so I should know it better than I do, but I think the most successful recent precedents were the Freedom Rider cases. There are a couple Freedom Rider cases where kids were pulled over on the road and then horrible things happened to them, and suits were brought under this same statute that we're using here.
So the next question is, who is defending the defendants and who is funding the defense?
So if anyone knows the answer to question 2, just let us know.
Tell us.
we're in hot pursuit of those facts. They have counsel. They're not people who were known to us before this case, but not all 24 defendants have their own counsel. Some of them are sort of in groups of counsel.
Well, there's one of the counsel there was an article about by the name of Kalenich, who's from Cincinnati, who believes the Holocaust never happened. And he's representing about 6 of them, I think, something like that.
Yeah, and then there was a lot of press coverage that Mr. Spencer had a hard time finding a lawyer.
Yeah.
So he fixed that.
So 2 of these are connected doesn't the First Amendment also not protect hate speech, and isn't this hate speech? So have you received any pushback from progressive organizations about your legal theory inhibiting free speech? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this, if it makes you feel better, this is the part I argued at the motion, and I also don't remember all the details. But long story short on this is we are not pursuing a theory of the case that revolves around speech at all. This is not a case about speech, it's a case about actions. And what we allege is not that a bunch of people got together and said mean things about Jews and black people. And that will not, it won't be possible to even think that that's what we're arguing when people see the evidence that we put on at trial. Everything that we are talking about has to do with the meticulous planning and execution of violence against people that is motivated by racial animus. And that is not something that the First Amendment has ever permitted. I'll also say that, frankly, if the First Amendment is an issue in this case, it is an issue that protects the plaintiffs and the people who are trying to speak out against what's happening in their communities in a nonviolent way. And in fact, by bringing this lawsuit, the plaintiffs are exercising their rights to do just that. So I just will be honest, I was never overly concerned about the First Amendment defense. I do think it's something that the defendants will try to get as much mileage as possible, because why would you not want to wrap yourself in the First Amendment? But it is really not relevant to a case that is so, and that's why this is such a great case to bring, is because it's not on the bubble. People were really injured. A guy ran a car over people. I mean, that's not speech.
I mean, if you think about it this way, if a bunch of people get together and they plan to rob a bank, and they have a lot of discussions, which is speech, about how to rob that bank, that speech is not protected under the First Amendment in proving that there was a successful conspiracy to rob the bank. That's basically what this case is. The only difference is that the conspiracy itself was motivated by hatred of Jewish people and black people and women and gay people. But it doesn't make their speech to effectuate their conspiracy protected by the First Amendment. And again, thanks to Karen's superb arguments, the judge had really no trouble, I think, buying our arguments here, and thought their arguments were kind of silly.
So do you think the lawsuit incites them to do more harm, or would they continue their attacks anyway?
That is also an excellent question, but I think demonstrably it is the case that we have deterred at least some amount of harm with this. Who's to tell? But everything that we have seen suggests that this has a deterrent effect, not an incitement effect.
Yeah, I mean, the alternative, which is not to sue and not to fight back, I think is not an acceptable alternative. We know what that would do. That would lead to only more and more and more of this. I love this country. My grandparents, great-grandparents came here and were given freedom in an unprecedented historical way. And I'm not going to let that change because of the actions of these guys who used to play video games in their parents' basements and now come up and think it's cool to smash people over the head with tiki torches and talk about violence. That's not acceptable. I don't care what political party's in power. I don't care what's on the internet. We don't let that happen here. And so again, I think that's the only alternative we have. And the difference is they fight on the streets, we fight back in court. That's what our Constitution says, and that's what we're going to do.
How does this case differ from the murder trial of James Fields, and how does that verdict affect your case?
Well, it's different in the following respect. Our case is a civil case, and that obviously was a criminal case. And, James Fields will go to prison for a long time if, indeed, the Commonwealth does not decide to pursue the death penalty. I don't think we know that yet. So in our case, obviously, we can't send anybody to prison, unfortunately, and we have only civil remedies at our disposal. So that is really the core of the distinction. That said, the Fields conviction was very well publicized, and it is quite possible that people will be aware of this coming into our case. Of course, they may not. It's always surprising what people are not aware of. But I do think that the fact that he is a member of our conspiracy and was convicted so quickly by a Virginia jury, to the extent that that is something that people are aware of, would potentially have an impact.
This is actually a great follow-up to that. So any concerns about jury selection, and how will defendants and jurors be protected?
Well, as to jury selection, I would say, I don't know if Robbie has any concerns. I really do not. I think it will be not a challenging thing to find an unbiased jury to hear this case. I think that the question about how the jurors and basically everybody in the courtroom is going to be protected is going to ultimately be a question that we need to put to the court. And I do think having been a prosecutor in a district that tried cases that were high profile, that had national security implications, this is a really unusual circumstance. And so at a certain point, I think the parties will likely go to the court and ask the court what the court would like to do in a very, very unusual security circumstance. And I assume that will be an issue for closer to trial.
And I mean, again, maybe I'm naive, but I believe that despite the security concerns, which are very real, there will be many, many jurors many people who will be willing to serve on this jury, and despite the concerns. I think this is part of who we are, and I think there are going to be a lot of good citizens who want to serve on this jury and want justice to be done.
Well, also, the El Chapo case got a jury, and I mean, you all
Still going on.
are undoubtedly watching that, and the security for that has been amazing. So that can be court ordered, and so I think Robbie's right. People want to serve on a jury like this, and I think courts want to protect the jury system. So those things will likely occur.
So a quick follow-up to that, what are you looking for in jurors?
I'm going to let the trial lawyer speak first.
We just want open-minded people. Yeah. We want people who are going to listen to the evidence, consider the evidence, and deliver a verdict that is consistent with that evidence.
I mean, the trial's going to be taking place in Charlottesville. The courthouse, federal courthouse in Charlottesville is actually quite small, and is on a corner. Everyone in the state of Virginia, much less the whole country, knew what happened. So we're not going to be able to find jurors who are unaware of what happened. But again, I think people are going to do the right thing and listen to the evidence, and I think won't have a very hard time concluding, as we have, that an unlawful conspiracy took place and that these people should be held responsible.
Yeah, so at least one way to get to this courthouse, you have to drive down Heather Heyer Way, where there is still this whole, it's a really narrow street. I mean, this is, I almost feel like we should take the jurors to see it. We should really think about that, because
5 blocks away.
It's close, and the street is really narrow. So the idea of being there with a crowd of people and having a car drive through it is really, I mean, if you look at it, you can just imagine the terror people must have felt being in that space. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the street is still with chalk messages of remembrances. Still today. I mean, this happened in August of 2017. And so when we went to the motion to dismiss hearing, I mean, we drove past the UVA campus where that all happened, and then drove down the street of the car attack. And I think, it's really hard to avoid how close to the community this was. So I do think that this is something that the jurors, almost whoever they are, may be aware of.
So this fall marked the 70th anniversary of Kristallnacht. How does that fact resonate in the context of Charlottesville and even more recent events?
Okay, so we happen to have a really good answer to that question, which is, so we've had a couple of victories in the case already. The big one was the motion to dismiss, which Karen described. But we had another one, which was to try to obtain some of these Discord chats that we've been talking about that we didn't already have. And in order to do that, you have to apply to the court, and we subpoenaed and tried to get information. And it turns out that a person who, I don't know their identity, I know it's a woman, who lives somewhere in California, her Discord handle was, believe it or not, Kristallnacht. And she had the unmitigated chutzpah to take the position that her right to remain anonymous was should be inviolate, and that we should not be able to get any chats involving her because she wanted her hatred and her anti-Semitism and everything else to remain secret. And so we had a whole motion practice about that in California. You won't be shocked to hear that we won. One of the things we said is we really don't have any interest in exposing Kristallnacht. We're trying to win our case. But it gives you a sense of the mentality of these people. I mean, they not only, they're obsessed with the Holocaust, and they kind of want to recreate the times of Nazi Germany when Kristallnacht happened here in the United States. There's just no question about it. That is their goal, and that's how they talk to each other.
So this is last question, and then we'll turn it back to you for any final thoughts that you have. Will the current racial issues going on in Virginia matter at all, especially since it seems some of the accusations against the lieutenant governor are from a conservative organization?
So I have believed from the beginning, as Robbie can attest, I think our case is just going to stand or fall on our own facts. And that's, and I think this is almost the case in any jury trial. When you are trapped together in a hermetically sealed environment for 4 weeks with a group of people, you all live and breathe and exist on the same set of facts. And so I don't actually think that a lot of, particularly something that's happening now, this is like 4 months is an eternity. But even if our trial were today, I would say this would not be relevant. I think we are going to have an experience that's going to be extremely intense with our jurors, who are going to focus very hard on the evidence that we are showing them, on the experiences of the plaintiffs who are going to come and testify and tell their stories and their experience, which I can't even tell you how moving it is. The last thing you're going to be thinking about is something that happened, to Lieutenant Governor. It's going to be like a very intense experience. And then, of course, the testimony of the defendants. So I expect that is going to take up all oxygen.
I agree. I mean, it's going to be, not only are they going to be immersed in these facts, but, the short video you saw is just the tip of the iceberg. They're going to have to be looking at some really disturbing stuff. And I think that's what they're going to be focused on.
Any final thoughts from you two?
Look, I don't think this is a hard audience to convince of how important this is. This is probably the easiest jury possible for Karen and me. But look, what I think is so important about this is we just cannot look aside. We cannot de-emphasize the seriousness of this threat. And the fact that in our lifetimes, this actually happened, like a pogrom happened on the streets of an American city. And we all need to dedicate ourselves, I believe, to making sure that it doesn't continue, and to making sure that the fundamental principle that this is just not acceptable in the United States of America, much less anywhere else in the world, but certainly in the United States of America, ever, ever, ever. And again, I like to focus on, we're not, Karen and I don't even own a tiki torch. I'm quite convinced Karen doesn't either. We're not looking to fight this in mobs on the street. We're looking to fight back in a court of law, into making sure that this principle is written into our country, so that we go back to the norms that this country lived by for so many years.
So as usual, I agree with Robbie. It's very easy to work together because we always agree. And so I have a more practical suggestion, which is if you're interested enough to listen to us for an hour, I would strongly suggest that you read our complaint. The complaint in this case, in part because Unicorn Riot released a lot of the Discord communications, is incredibly detailed. And it is the only place where the entire story of Charlottesville is told. And it is really arresting. Anybody that reads it is, I think moved and inspired to action. And Amy tells me that the complaint is on the integrityfirstforamerica.org website. If not, we can send it to you. But I would really urge you to read it and send it to people so that people are aware of exactly what happened and how it happened and why we're doing this.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Robbie and Karen for being here tonight, and to all of you for coming out, and for everyone watching online. Really appreciate everyone who came out. And again, integrityfirstforamerica.org, if you're willing to lend your name, show the plaintiffs that you stand behind them as we start to head towards trial. Read the complaint as Karen suggested, and find a whole host of other information about the lawsuit there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I just want to invite all of us, we took in a lot of information this evening, just to take a breath and maybe to call to mind and think about something you are walking away with tonight that feels inspiring or hopeful in the face of the violence and the hatred that we saw at the beginning of the evening. We're really lucky to have the opportunity to bring the knowledge and the expertise and the hope that you and this case bring to this reality that's true in our country right now. And we hope that you'll leave tonight inspired to take some of the actions that we were invited to do, and also to learn more. Tonight is the first program in our month-long series on anti-Semitism and white nationalism. To your point, Robbie, earlier about anti-Semitism really underpinning the violence in Charlottesville, 2 weeks from tomorrow, we'll have Eric Ward here. Eric Ward is the director of the Western States Center. He is a civil rights leader and an expert in white nationalism and anti-Semitism, and he will speak particularly to that question of how anti-Semitism is at the foundation of white nationalism in this country. So we hope you'll join us on February 20th for that. Next week on Thursday, Rabbi Jill Jacobs and Yair Rosenberg in conversation on anti-Semitism across the political spectrum and the complexities of anti-Semitism in this country. All of that can be found on the handout that you either picked up or you can take on your way out, along with some other programs and activities that are happening through PANIM, our social action and social justice work. So we hope you'll spend the month learning with us, growing with us, and taking action with us. I particularly want to thank Larissa Wohl, who really made this evening possible and put together all of the logistics. Many, many emails that went back and forth to make this evening come together. And thank you to Amy and Karen and Robbie for being here. Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.